Hello, I'm Kirsty Young, and this is a podcast from the Desert Island Discs archive. For rights reasons, we've had to shorten the music. The programme was originally broadcast in 1989, and the presenter was Sue Lawley.
My castaway this week is an exile. She is a Mitford girl, one of the 6 fascinating daughters of Lord Redesdale. This daughter married Sir Oswald Mosley, the man who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Like him, she was imprisoned during much of the war and accompanied him abroad once it was over. Since his death nearly 9 years ago, she has lived alone just outside Paris. Today, 50 years after the events which changed her life forever, she remains an example of the passions and tragedies of her family, as well as a reminder of things that were and those that might have been. She is Diana Mosley. I call you an exile, Lady Mosley, but that's a self-imposed state, isn't it?
Oh, it is, yes. I don't consider myself an exile at all. I just prefer to live near Paris.
You live in what I read is a beautiful Palladian country house. Can you describe it to me?
Well, it's a tiny little house, but it is very beautiful.
And the garden? Tell me about the garden.
Well, it's got a garden. It's got a flower garden. I suppose you might say a sort of English garden, but I don't allow any flowers near the house. It's all green and stone and hedges and lawn.
Why do you not like to have flowers near the house?
Because I think it's quite unsuitable for Palladian architecture, which is in essence really Italian. So it should be, I think, green.
Now, is that house, would you say, having spent the best part of the last 50 years there, is that house where your heart is, or is it France where your heart is?
It's the house, but it is also France. I love living in France. I love Paris. Paris has kept its beauty in a way that I'm afraid London has not.
So have you any desire at all to return here to your roots to Britain?
No. I prefer living there.
Have you any desire to be cast away on a far-flung desert island?
No, not at all. But I am, I suppose, in a way cast away because I'm quite alone most of the time. I'm quite accustomed to that and I love being alone.
So what sort of music would you like to play to while away the time?
Well, I suppose I should like the music I've loved all my life.
What's the first piece that you've chosen?
The first is the Jupiter Symphony of Mozart. And I chose that because it was the first really beautiful, sublime music I ever heard. And I suppose I must have been about 14. My brother was extremely musical, my brother Tom. He was a wonderful pianist himself, and although we only had a wind-up gramophone, we were able to listen to symphonies and so on, and I suppose he really introduced me to great music.
The opening of Mozart's Symphony No. 41 in C, The Jupiter, with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham. Music which you first heard, Lady Mosley, on your wind-up gramophone at home in the Cotswolds. It was, from all that's been written about it, that life, and mostly written about by your very prolific sisters, it was a very unconventional household.
Well, people think so now, but you see, we thought we were very ordinary. Because when I was a child, it was quite usual for girls not to go to school, for example, and to have a governess at home, as we did. And I had a great horror of the idea of having to leave home and go to school. And I never did.
But was it, as it reads, a chaotic household, full of laughter?
Full of laughter, yes, because my father was so amusing, and then my sister Nancy also. And there was a great deal of laughter.
But you were quite frightened of your father too, weren't you?
Well, I suppose we were quite frightened. We were quite frightened of my mother too. I mean, we were quite in awe of them. But on the whole, Lucy, he used to make so many jokes. He was such an amusing man, really. And I was devoted to him.
But for you as a child, Nanny was the centre of your life, was she?
Yes, you're quite right, she was. I really loved her more than my parents as far as love goes. And her threat, if we were naughty, she used to say I should go and pack my trunk. And I really believed it, nearly killed one with horror, the idea of not having her. But she was a wonderful person, and she stayed with us until my youngest sister was grown up, and then retired, and she lived to be over 90.
As the years went by, did you, or did any of you, realise that you, the Mitford girls, were really rather special?
Absolutely not, no. And in fact, I really don't believe we were particularly special. I think it's something that's been invented of late years, really, by the newspapers.
But you were phenomenally talented in all sorts of different ways.
I'm afraid not. We were bad at nearly everything. We were always the worst at games and worst at everything, really. We didn't consider ourselves at all talented.
But rather imaginative and rather good with words.
Well, I suppose we were great readers. You see, we had one very precious thing at home, which is a wonderful library, which had been collected by generations, not by my father. He never read a book. But he didn't mind us taking books out of the library, provided we put them back. And nobody censored our reading. And I think that probably was how we educated ourselves, because the governesses were fairly limited.
Shall we hear your second piece of music?
The next one is Maria Callas. It's the aria from Norma, and it shows Callas at her great, extraordinary best, her very, very beautiful, tender voice she had.
Maria Callas singing the aria Casta Diva from Bellini's Norma with the orchestra of La Scala Milan, conducted by Tullio Serafin. What, Lady Mosley, did you 6 girls think would happen to you in later life? You had no preparation at all for the outside world.
No, and my father sometimes used to say, I think he did it to tease us, really, I hope you children realise you'll have to earn your own living. I've got no money to leave you. And then we all used to begin to cry because we couldn't think what we could possibly do which would earn us anything.
So marriage was seemingly the only option?
Well, you see, we didn't think about marriage. At least I didn't. It was the last thing I thought of. And of course that, I suppose, in a way, is what most people in those days, they thought if you were a girl, that's what you did, you married.
So you delighted, didn't you, in being a deb in the 20s? You came up to London and had a wonderfully gay time.
Yes, I had great fun. I was fairly disappointed in a way by it. But, of course, I almost immediately married, really.
You married Brian Guinness?
I married Brian Guinness when I was 18. And then, really, of course, life became great fun. Because, you see, all his Oxford friends and so on, they really were extremely brilliant people. I mean, they remain my friends all my life. Very few left now, but for instance, there's Harold Acton and Peter Quinnell. I think they're about the only ones left of that generation.
Well, now, you'd been married for about 3 years and you had 2 children by Brian Guinness when, in 1932, you met a leading politician of the time, Oswald Mosley. Can you recall that meeting?
Yes, I can, really. We were at a dinner party, and we were next to one another. But then after that, we met constantly because, see, he was out of Parliament and went everywhere with his wife. and we went all over the place, and I suppose we met perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. And he was fascinating.
So you met, as we said, in 1932. You were both married to other people, but
Yes.
you were both very strongly, mutually attracted. And not long after that, you were to become lovers.
Well, I left my first husband and never dreamed of marrying Mosley. There was no question of it. He was very happily married. But nevertheless, I thought it was really better to make a clean break and live on my own, which I did subsequently.
But subsequently, his wife, in fact, died.
Well,
and,
she died. In those days, if you had appendicitis and you had peritonitis, it was before the days of antibiotics, and you just did die. I mean, it was quite the usual thing to happen with bad appendicitis.
And so it was that some 4 years later, in 1936, you were able to marry.
After about 3 or 4 years, we married.
Would it be fair to say that despite the deal of suffering that your association with Mosley brought you, nevertheless, your memories are ones of blissful happiness?
Yes, it would be right.
Shall we have your third record there?
Well, it's the final movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and I choose that for the island because it's so optimistic. Well, that would chase away dull care, wouldn't it?
Certainly would. The Ode to Joy from the final movement of Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, the Choral Symphony, with the Philharmonia Orchestra and chorus conducted by Otto Klemperer. It was, Lady Mosley, at about the time that you met Sir Oswald that he was founding the British Union of Fascists. Why was he so attracted by fascism?
It was just a name then which was given to a movement which was more or less worldwide, really, or generate all over Europe, which embodied, I suppose you'd say, a great many of his economic ideas.
But it was a party which he decided should wear a uniform, the black shirt, and should have certain military overtones, the salute and so on.
Yes, well, the black shirt had various advantages, really. One was that it was extremely cheap. I think it cost a shilling, and therefore unemployed people could wear it. And so if you had that and grey flannel trousers, nobody knew what your background was, and it made for a sort of comradeship, he thought. I think it probably did. And it was such a success that an Act of Parliament had to be passed to forbid them wearing it.
Was not that Act of Parliament passed for rather different reasons? That is to say that when they wore that uniform and they marched through the inner cities of London and Manchester, great violence came in its wake.
Well, they were attacked by communists, but not really. I mean, the very often very peaceful marches, for instance, through East London and through Manchester, all the big cities, really.
But people were injured in these demonstrations.
Yes, when there's a fight, people are injured, of course.
It was a movement which, in the beginning, was supported by very many what one might call respectable conservatives, was it not?
A certain number, because they also saw that there was a hopeless situation, really. England was in a very bad way.
But they were people, those respectable conservatives, who were to fall out of love with the movement when it became increasingly violent.
Yes, well, you see, I think people are extremely unfaithful in politics. I mean, they're very disloyal. They're delighted with somebody, and then they suddenly become less delighted with them.
Was your husband, Lady Mosley, anti-Semitic?
He really wasn't. You know, he didn't know a Jew from a Gentile himself, but as the Jews were so anti him and attacked as much as they possibly could both in the newspapers and physically when there were marches in places like Manchester and so on, where there were a lot of people. He, as it were, picked up the challenge. And then a great number of his followers, who really were anti-Semitic, joined him because they thought they were able to fight their old enemy.
But did he not call them an alien force? Did he not say in a speech once in 1936, they were an alien force which rises to rob us of our heritage?
Yes, you see, one of the things that horrified him was that we had this enormous empire, and he did think that the Jews and the city in general invested far too much in countries that had nothing to do with our empire.
And how did he and you feel when you discovered that Hitler's version of anti-Semitism was to end in extermination?
Well, you see, we didn't discover that for so long. First of all, after the war, I simply didn't believe it, having been in Germany a good bit, because my sister more or less lived there, really. And it was years before I could really believe that such things had happened.
And do you believe it now?
I don't really, I'm afraid, believe that 6 million people would. I think it's just not conceivable. It's too many. But you see, whether it's 6 or whether it's 1 really makes no difference morally. It's equally wrong. I think it was a dreadfully wicked thing myself.
Shall we hear your next piece of music?
It's the end of the first act of Die Walküre, sung by Maria Müller as Sieglinde and Wolfgang Windgassen as Siegmund.
Heilige Schwester, befreite der Bruder, zerbricht, was liegt, was je sie getrennt. Ja, zerbricht sich das junge Paar vereint.
Part of Wagner's Die Walküre, sung by Wolfgang Windgassen and Maria Müller, and the Württembergische State Orchestra, conducted by Ferdinand Leitner. Valkyrie was, in fact, the second name of your sister Unity, wasn't it?
Yes, it was, because she was born at the outbreak of the First War.
She was a young woman fascinated by Adolf Hitler, wasn't she?
Completely fascinated. Yeah.
Why?
She loved being with him. He was, of course, extraordinarily fascinating and clever. Naturally, you don't get to be where he was just by being the kind of person people like to think he was.
You met him quite a lot as well, didn't
yes, many times, really. Of course, at that moment, you see, he was the person who was making the news, what you might say, and therefore extremely interesting to talk to.
Did you admire him?
Very much. He had extraordinary sort of mesmeric eyes. I think many people remarked that. Blue eyes. And also he had so much to say. I mean, he was so interesting, fascinating, perfectly willing to talk.
You communicated in German?
Yes, he didn't know any English.
He was in fact a guest at your wedding, wasn't he?
He was a guest, yes.
Now, you were a guest of Hitler's a couple of weeks, I think, only before the declaration of war in 1939.
Well, a month before. Yes, because we were at Bayreuth, really. He invited us. But when he told us about the war, that he felt sure it was coming, that was a luncheon that he gave at Warnfried.
He said war was inevitable.
Yes, he said he wanted to speak to us privately, and then he said, I'm afraid war is inevitable.
You've written since that on hearing him say that war was inevitable, you were not just in despair for the reasons that you described, but also because you knew that it would mean the death of your sister?
I knew it would mean the death of my sister, but I also knew it would mean the death of millions of other people. And of course, my brother was killed in the war, my only brother. And they were really the two of the family in a way that were nearest to me, because I was between them. I was in the middle of the family. And of course, that was a tremendous sorrow.
But how did you know it would mean the death of your sister?
That unity would. She'd always said so. She said she didn't wish to live if England and Germany were at war. She felt very, very attached to Germany, but of course she naturally loved our own country, so that she was torn in two, and she said she couldn't live through that.
And indeed she put a gun to her head shortly afterwards. Yes. Shall we have your fifth piece of music there?
Our conversation is so sad that the records seem rather out of place. Yes, well, now we have Kirsten Flagstad singing the Liebestod from Tristan and Isolde. And the conductor is Furtwängler, a conductor who was very much admired by everyone. Hitler admired him very much and gave him what they call a golden button.
That was Kirsten Flagstad singing the Liebestod from Wagner's Tristan and Isolde with the Philharmonia Orchestra conducted by Wilhelm Furtwängler. The war also cost you and your husband dear, of course, Lady Mosley, because you were both imprisoned shortly after it began.
Well, not very shortly after. You see, they kept saying one of the evil things we're fighting against is that there's no free speech in Germany. And here, of course, we have free speech. So, having been told that, he held meetings. He always was expecting to be told by the police now there to be no more meetings, or by the government, whichever. But he never was. And he always said it would have been very cowardly, believing as he did that the war was a terrible mistake, and that we could have a negotiated peace before either England or the Empire had been attacked in any way. He must speak his mind.
But wasn't that a grave miscalculation to stand up and support a system of government and a cause which had now become this country's greatest enemy?
Well, you see, it was what they call the phony war. Nothing had happened between England and Germany, or the Empire and Germany. And then as you know, of course, the Germans invaded Norway. And we invaded Norway, although it was a neutral country. And the Germans won. I mean, they just occupied it. Well, after that, obviously it was really war. And he then said, of course, the newspapers now are beginning to speak of invasion. And if any such thing would happen, there's no question of where British Union would stand. We'd fight to the last man to drive the foreign invader from our soil. So in other words, the phony war was then over, and it wouldn't have occurred to him after that to speak for negotiated peace. It seemed too late.
But undoubtedly you were both seen as potential traitors.
I don't think so. Certainly not by people like Churchill, who knew us. I mean, it never occurred to me I should be arrested.
Why do you think, then, that you were both imprisoned?
I think, but of course we've no way of proving it, because there's no paper saying so, but I think probably Labour, the Labour Party, who formed an important part of the coalition because obviously if you go to war you can't have different parties. It's got to be united. I think they probably said one of their conditions for making a coalition would be for us, well, not me, I don't think, but my husband to be arrested.
But surely Churchill would not have accepted such a condition from the Labour.
I think he would. He would do anything to prosecute the war. He did accept it. And he's constantly said during our imprisonment to Randolph, who used to hand it on to my brother, Tom, he used to say, of course, I don't believe in this fifth column. And he knew perfectly well that we were not traitors.
To listen to you speak, Lady Mosley, sometimes when you're talking about those events of so long ago, it's almost, I think some people would say, as if you're rewriting history.
No, that's just how it was. I can remember it so well. It's very, very vivid in my memory.
Tell me what it was like in prison. You were put into Holloway, weren't you, and your husband into Brixton?
Well, first of all, it was utterly and completely disgusting, the dirt and the horror of prison. But you see, the awful thing for me was leaving the children, because I had 4 children, 2 boys aged 8 and 10, and 2 babies, one 18 months and the other a few weeks old. And that really was dreadful, because, of course, years went by and they changed completely. And one missed all those years of them.
Shall we pause for some more music there?
Well, now we've got a very exciting record from Carmen. Again, I'm afraid not really very relevant to all these dreadful things we've been speaking of.
Julia McGuinness-Johnson singing the Habanera from Bizet's Carmen with the French National Orchestra conducted by Lauren Marsel. So you and your husband left this country in 1951 for France, and really you've lived there ever since.
Yes.
Sir Oswald died, didn't he, in 1980?
He died in 1980. He was 84.
You together were great friends of the Windsors, weren't you?
We were quite friends because they were neighbours, really, in the same valley as us. And they were always extremely kind.
And she was a marvellous hostess, I gather, the Duchess.
She was. I mean, she really was. Fantastic. The food was too lovely for words, and the whole sort of ambiance was great fun. She always made things great fun. I remember somebody saying she made a fete of any dinner where she took such trouble over, I suppose, even flowers, everything. She was obviously perfect for that, no doubt.
And was it always obvious how much the Duke adored her?
Yes, it was. Absolutely obvious. Whoever he was sitting next to, he always had half a year for her and half an hour. But of course he had charming manners.
Did she, do you believe, adore him as much in return?
I don't suppose she adored him as much as he adored her, but she was extremely courteous and affectionate. They were, one must admit, they were extremely happy, as far as it goes. I think that all the running came from him. I don't think she the least bit wanted the marriage or to be queen or anything like that. She would like to go on as she was, I feel sure. But having said that, I mean, she made the best of it.
You and Sir Oswald, of course, had something in common with them in a sense, that you were both in a kind of exile.
Well, yes, well, you say that because they really were exiles, because he refused utterly to go back, as long as she was not given her proper title. But there was nothing of that sort for us. We went back constantly, and he never considered himself an exile. He considered himself a European.
Was there a sense in which your husband was, if you like, waiting for the call?
Well, they say that, but of course he used to laugh at the mere idea there'd be no, he knew there'd be no call. But he nevertheless, whatever crisis arose, and heaven knows there've been a good many since the war, one way and another, he always thought very carefully and had a solution for it. And so I think some of his solutions probably were actually adopted.
What do you think today of Britain?
It's very hard to say. You see, in London, for example, I love the denizens, I love the Londoners, I love my relations who live here and so on. But I can't say I should really like to have to live in London and see it gradually made uglier and uglier as the days go by.
Shall we pause there for your 7th record? What's that?
Now, I've chosen one pop record. It's partly because it's really based on Handel, I think. Also because it's got such mysterious words, and also because it was such a favourite tune on the French wireless that whenever I was waiting for the news or something in French, they used to play it. And it happened to be a very hot, delicious, happy summer at the temple where I live. And so it's got memories for me, but it's not really my kind of music otherwise. I mean, I'm not a great pop fan.
As the miller told his tale, let her face at first just ghostly turn the wider shade of pale.
I should like to make one comment on my choice. There seems to be a great deal of singing, and normally speaking, I would have had more symphony and Beethoven's quartet, I love, but my terrible deafness forbids me to hear strings, and so that really the only thing I can hear more or less is the human voice and orchestra up to a point, but I lose a tremendous lot. And music means much less to me than it did. I have to remember it.
And what about your memories of the gaiety and the laughter of bygone years? Do you miss all of that?
No, because I still have just as much laughter. I've got wonderful friends in Paris and here, and I'm afraid we laugh the whole time.
Do you have, Lady Mosley, any great regrets about your life?
I'm not sure, really, whether I have. I sometimes wonder whether... You see, had I had the slightest idea that I should be imprisoned, I would have never have touched, we'll say, I would have given up going to Germany or whatever. But first of all, I hoped there was going to be peace. I never really believed there would be a war. I hoped human reason would prevail. But had I known, I suppose I really would have felt my duties with my children, because it's a dreadful thing to miss 3.5 years of their lives.
Do you then, from what you say, regret your friendship with Hitler?
I can't regret that. It was so interesting and fascinating. All the well-known and famous people I've known in my life, I couldn't regret having known them, because for one thing, it's something to measure by, the nonsense that gets written. And I suppose it will be till doomsday, because that is not only journalism, but I'm afraid it's human nature. If you don't like somebody, you attack them.
Shall we have your last piece of music?
Well, now, this is something I can hear fairly well, which is piano. Alexander Bailovsky, who plays Chopin so beautifully.
Alexander Brailovsky playing Chopin's Polonaise in F-sharp minor, opus 44. Well, now, as you set sail, Lady Mosley, for our desert island, which of the records that you've chosen do you think you will treasure most?
I think I might treasure most the Valkyrie.
Why?
It's so romantic and beautiful, really.
And what book would you like to find waiting for you on the beach, alongside the Bible and Shakespeare?
I'm very happy to have the Bible and Shakespeare for many reasons. Probably the chief reason, I hope it's the authorised version, is that it's early 17th century English, which is so beautiful. But they are rather short on jokes, so I thought I might have Proust if I'm allowed his novel. It's rather long. So I've read it many times, but each time one finds new beauties and new things to laugh at. It makes you laugh out loud.
And of all the things that you have known in this material life, what luxury would you most like to have supplied to comfort you?
I think for my luxury I'd choose a soft pillow and soft rug.
Diana, Lady Mosley, thank you very much indeed for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Desert Island Discs archive. For more podcasts, please visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4.